Hello, and welcome to History Turned. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Cleopatra. You see her, don't you? She is reclining on a golden throne, draped in white linen, her eyes lined with thick black kohl. She is impossibly beautiful, a woman so enchanting that the most powerful men in the world lost their minds over her. Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, two of the greatest Romans who ever lived, both brought to their knees by the same Egyptian queen. You picture her floating down the Nile on a perfumed barge, surrounded by servants waving peacock feathers. You picture her dissolving a pearl in a cup of wine just to win a bet. You picture her smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up inside a carpet, tumbling out at his feet like a gift from the gods. And then at the end, you picture her death, alone in her chamber, a small, deadly snake coiled around her arm, the asp pressed to her skin, the final dramatic act of a woman who chose death over humiliation. This is Cleopatra as the world knows her, a seductress, a temptress, a woman whose greatest weapons were her beauty and her charm. But here is what you were never told. Almost everything you just pictured is either a myth, a distortion, or a deliberate lie told by her enemies. The real Cleopatra was something far more extraordinary than any legend. She was not famous for her beauty. Ancient sources suggest she was attractive, but not exceptionally so. What made her truly extraordinary, what made her genuinely one of the most remarkable human beings of the ancient world, was her mind. She was a mathematician, a linguist who spoke 9 languages, a naval strategist, a philosopher, a politician of breathtaking skill who ruled the wealthiest kingdom on earth for 21 years and nearly, very nearly, changed the entire course of Western history. She was not a seductress who used powerful men. She was a sovereign who formed calculated political alliances with the most powerful empire on earth to save her country. And when that empire finally came for her, she refused to be paraded through Rome in chains, choosing to end her own life on her own terms. Tonight, we tell the real story of Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, pharaoh, goddess, and one of the greatest political minds the ancient world ever produced. But before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to History Turned. It is a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal. I am always curious to know where in the world and at what time you are joining tonight, so please leave a comment and let me know. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back 2,050 years to a city of white marble and blue water, where the fate of the ancient world was about to be decided by a 21-year-old woman who had just been driven from her own throne. To understand Cleopatra, you must first understand Alexandria. Imagine arriving by ship. You have been at sea for days, the Mediterranean a vast gray-green expanse stretching in every direction. Your back aches from the hard wooden bench. Your mouth tastes of salt and stale water. The other passengers around you are traders, soldiers, scholars, people drawn from every corner of the known world, all heading to the same destination. And then as your ship rounds a headland, you see it. First, the light. A beam so powerful, it can be seen from 50 miles out to sea. It comes from the top of the Pharos, the great lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stands over 130 meters tall, taller than almost any structure on Earth at the time, and its mirror of polished bronze reflects the sun by day and a massive fire by night, guiding ships safely into the harbor. As you draw closer, the city itself emerges from the morning haze. Alexandria in 69 BC, the year Cleopatra was born, is not an Egyptian city in any traditional sense. It is a Greek city built on the Egyptian coast by Alexander the Great himself 300 years earlier, designed from the very beginning to be the capital of a new kind of world, a world where Greek culture, Egyptian tradition, and the commerce of the entire Mediterranean would meet and fuse into something entirely new. The harbor is extraordinary. It is one of the largest and busiest in the world, filled with ships from Rome, Greece, Arabia, India, and beyond. The air smells of fish and salt water, of exotic spices from the east, of cedar wood being unloaded from Phoenician vessels. The docks are a constant roar of shouting sailors, creaking ropes, and the heavy thud of cargo being transferred from ship to shore. Behind the harbor, the city stretches in a perfect grid of wide, straight streets, a design inherited from the Greek tradition of rational urban planning. The main avenue, the Canopic Way, is 45 meters wide, flanked by colonnades of pale stone columns. On a busy day, it is filled with a crowd so cosmopolitan it would not look out of place in a modern international city. Greeks and Egyptians, Jews and Persians, Romans and Nubians, all jostling together in the warm Egyptian sun. At the heart of the city stands the royal quarter, the Brucheion, a vast complex of palaces, temples, and gardens that occupies nearly a third of the entire city. This is where Cleopatra will be born, where she will be educated, where she will first hold power, then lose it, then fight to reclaim it. And at the edge of the royal quarter, visible from almost everywhere in the city, stands the most important building in the ancient world, the Library of Alexandria. The library is not just a building, it is an idea made physical. It is the belief, radical and ambitious, that all human knowledge can be collected, organized, and preserved in one place. At its height, the library holds between 400,000 and 700,000 papyrus scrolls. It contains the collected works of Aristotle, the plays of Sophocles, medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, philosophical arguments, poetry, history, geography, the entire intellectual output of the ancient world, gathered under one roof in this impossible city on the edge of the Egyptian desert. Attached to the library is the museum, not a museum in the modern sense, but a research institution, a place where the greatest scholars of the age are paid by the state to do nothing but think. Euclid developed geometry here. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth here and got it almost exactly right, 2,000 years before the invention of modern measurement tools. Aristarchus proposed that the earth revolves around the sun here, 1,700 years before Copernicus. This is the world into which Cleopatra is born, not the Egypt of the pyramids. Those ancient monuments are already 1,500 years old by the time she takes her first breath, as old to her as the Roman Empire is to us. No, Cleopatra is born into this extraordinary, cosmopolitan, intellectually electric city, a place that is simultaneously the wealthiest, most sophisticated, and most politically dangerous city in the world. Because Alexandria in 69 BC is a city under enormous pressure, and the source of that pressure sits, as it almost always does in this era, in Rome. To understand Cleopatra, you must also understand her family. And her family is, to put it mildly, complicated. Cleopatra is a Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty was founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, a man named Ptolemy I, who seized Egypt after Alexander's death and declared himself pharaoh in 305 BC. His descendants had ruled Egypt ever since, a dynasty of Greek-speaking kings and queens who adopted Egyptian customs and titles while maintaining their Macedonian Greek heritage. The Ptolemaic royal family was extraordinarily wealthy. Egypt under their rule was the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean world. The fertile Nile Delta produced grain that fed much of the ancient world. Alexandria controlled the trade routes between the Mediterranean and the East. The royal family owned the land, the ports, the trade, and the taxes. Their wealth was so vast that it is almost impossible to comprehend by modern standards. But the Ptolemaic family had a problem that no amount of wealth could solve. They were, to put it bluntly, extraordinarily dysfunctional. The history of the Ptolemaic dynasty reads less like a royal chronicle and more like a particularly violent soap opera. Brothers murdered sisters, sisters poisoned brothers, mothers eliminated their own children, children overthrew their parents. Alliances were formed, broken, and reformed with dizzying speed. The palace in Alexandria was a place of breathtaking beauty and constant mortal danger, where a wrong word to the wrong person could end your life before breakfast. This was not unusual for ancient dynasties. Power concentrated in a single family tends to produce exactly this kind of violence. But the Ptolemies had refined the art of internal destruction to a particularly high standard. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII, known to history by the rather unflattering nickname Auletes, the flute player, because of his love of music. He was not a strong king. He was a man desperately trying to hold together a kingdom that was slowly being swallowed by the growing shadow of Rome. Because by the time of Cleopatra's birth, Rome was not just a powerful city. It was the greatest military and political force the world had ever seen. Under generals like Pompey and Julius Caesar, Rome was systematically absorbing the kingdoms of the Mediterranean one by one. Greece had fallen, Syria had fallen, the kingdoms of Asia Minor had fallen. Egypt, wealthy, ancient, magnificent Egypt, was the last great independent kingdom left, and everyone in Alexandria knew that Rome was watching. Ptolemy XII responded to this threat in the only way he knew how. He paid. He borrowed enormous sums of money from Roman bankers and used it to bribe Roman senators to officially recognize his rule and guarantee Egypt's independence. The sums involved were staggering, the equivalent of the entire annual tax revenue of Egypt, borrowed at ruinous interest rates. To pay back these debts, Ptolemy was forced to raise taxes to crushing levels, impoverishing his own people. When he traveled to Rome in person to secure his political position, the people of Alexandria, furious at his absence and his taxation, rioted and expelled him. He was forced to spend 3 years in exile, pleading with Roman officials to help him retake his throne. He eventually succeeded, returning to Alexandria with Roman soldiers at his back. But the damage to his reputation was permanent. He was seen as a weak king, a man who had humiliated himself before the Romans, a ruler who put his own survival above the dignity of his kingdom. This is the father who raised Cleopatra, and strange as it may seem, he raised her well. Because Ptolemy XII, for all his political failures, understood one thing with absolute clarity. His kingdom was surrounded by enemies, both foreign and domestic. To survive in this world, his children needed to be exceptional, not just competent, exceptional, and so Cleopatra was educated with a rigor and depth that was extraordinarily unusual for a girl in the ancient world. Picture the royal library on a cool morning, just after dawn. The light comes through high, narrow windows, falling in long golden shafts onto rows of wooden shelves lined with papyrus scrolls. The room smells of old paper and cedar oil, a smell that is, if you can imagine it, the smell of accumulated human knowledge. Somewhere in this building are the original manuscripts of playwrights and philosophers whose names you know, their actual words, written in their own time, preserved in this extraordinary place. A girl of perhaps 10 years old sits at a low wooden table. Her name is Cleopatra. She is slight, with dark eyes that move quickly and miss nothing. In front of her are several unrolled scrolls, their edges weighted down with small stones. Beside her sits a tutor, an elderly scholar from the museum, one of the finest minds in the world. He is teaching her mathematics today, not the simple arithmetic of commerce, but the deeper mathematics of Euclid, geometry, proportion, the relationships between numbers and space that underpin the architecture of the universe. She follows his explanations with a focus that makes him, privately, think she is the most naturally intelligent student he has ever taught. But mathematics is only one small part of her education. Cleopatra's education is managed by the scholars of the museum, the greatest concentration of intellectual talent in the ancient world. She studies rhetoric, the art of argument and persuasion. She studies philosophy, both Greek and Egyptian. She studies astronomy, able to read the movements of the stars and calculate the positions of the planets. She studies medicine, learning from the medical texts in the library and from the physicians who serve the royal court. She studies military strategy, reading the accounts of Alexander's campaigns and the tactical writings of Greek generals. And she studies languages. This is perhaps her most extraordinary gift. In a dynasty where every previous ruler for nearly 300 years had spoken only Greek, refusing to learn the native Egyptian language of their own subjects, Cleopatra taught herself Egyptian. Not just conversational Egyptian, but formal, written Egyptian, the hieroglyphic script used in religious ceremonies, and the demotic script used in everyday administration. She did not stop there. She learned the languages of every people her kingdom traded with or negotiated with: Ethiopic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Parthian, the language of the Medes, Latin. By the time she was an adult, Cleopatra spoke 9 languages fluently. Think about what this meant in practice. When an ambassador arrived from Ethiopia, Cleopatra could speak to him directly, without an interpreter, in his own language. When a delegation of Jewish merchants came to discuss trade, she could address them in Hebrew. When Roman generals arrived, she could speak to them in Latin, their own tongue, with a fluency that immediately communicated something profound. She was not like the foreign monarchs they were used to dealing with. She was their intellectual equal, or more. The ancient writer Plutarch, one of our most important sources for her life, makes this point explicitly. He writes that her speech was like a musical instrument with many strings. She could shift from one language to another without hesitation, and very few of the foreign ambassadors who came to her court required a translator. He also says something else that is crucial. He says that her physical appearance, while attractive, was not her most striking quality. It was her conversation, the intelligence and the wit in her voice, the sense when talking to her that you were in the presence of someone whose mind was operating at a level above almost everyone else in the room. This is the real Cleopatra, not a beautiful woman using her looks to manipulate powerful men, but a brilliant woman using her extraordinary intellect to navigate the most dangerous political situation in the ancient world. She would need every bit of that intellect, because by the time she was 18 years old, her education was about to meet its most terrifying test. In 51 BC, Ptolemy XII died. He was not a great king, but he had managed to hold his kingdom together, which was more than many had expected of him, and in his final will, he left the throne of Egypt to his 2 eldest children to be shared jointly. His daughter, Cleopatra VII, who was 18 years old, and his son, Ptolemy XIII, who was 10 years old. In accordance with Ptolemaic tradition, the siblings were to marry each other, a custom that sounds horrifying to modern ears, but was standard practice in the dynasty, designed to keep power within the family. It was a marriage in name and legal ceremony only. There is no evidence it was ever anything more than a political formality. But the arrangement created an immediate problem. Cleopatra was 18, brilliant, and had been educated specifically to rule. Her brother was 10 years old. In theory, they were co-rulers. In practice, there was never any real question about who was actually going to govern Egypt. Cleopatra took control immediately and decisively. She began appearing on official documents with her name listed first. She conducted diplomatic correspondence. She traveled to the south of Egypt, something no Ptolemaic ruler had done in generations, to personally oversee a religious ceremony and be seen by her own people. She began learning the religious rituals of the Egyptian priesthood, positioning herself not just as a Greek queen, but as a genuine Egyptian pharaoh in the ancient tradition. She was, by all accounts, an extraordinary ruler, decisive, intelligent, genuinely engaged with the well-being of her kingdom in a way that set her apart from many of her predecessors. But she had enemies. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was 10 years old, but he had advisors, 3 of them, powerful men named Pothinus, Achillas, and Theodotus. These men had their own ambitions, their own networks of influence within the court, and their own vision for how Egypt should be governed. And that vision did not include a strong, independent queen who had no need of their counsel. For 3 years, Cleopatra and her brother's advisors fought a cold political war within the palace. It was a battle conducted through official documents, court appointments, and the careful cultivation of loyalties among the nobility and the military. And then, in 48 BC, the Cold War turned hot. Ptolemy XIII's advisors moved against her. They used their control of the Egyptian army to force Cleopatra out of Alexandria. She fled into exile in the desert to the eastern border region between Egypt and Syria, where she began frantically raising her own army from local tribes and mercenaries. At 21 years old, Cleopatra was a queen without a throne, camped in the desert with a small and poorly equipped force, facing an Egyptian army that vastly outnumbered her own. Her brother's forces held Alexandria, they held the treasury, they held the legitimacy of the state. By any rational calculation, her cause was lost. And then, as if scripted by some particularly dramatic god of history, the most powerful man in the world arrived in Egypt. His name was Julius Caesar. The story of how Cleopatra first met Julius Caesar is one of the most famous scenes in all of history. And yes, unlike many of the legends surrounding her, this one appears to be essentially true. But let us understand the context, because the context is everything. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his great rival, Pompey. Rome had been torn apart by civil war between these two men, the two most powerful Romans of their generation, and Caesar had won. Pompey had fled to Egypt, hoping to find refuge with Ptolemy XIII, whose family had long-standing ties to Rome. It was a desperate gamble. It did not work. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, calculating as always, decided that backing the losing side in a Roman civil war was not good policy. When Pompey's ship arrived in the harbor of Alexandria, he was welcomed with apparent warmth, invited to come ashore. As he stepped from his small boat, still within sight of his own ships, he was stabbed to death. His head was cut off and preserved to be presented to Caesar as a gift. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later and was presented with the severed head of his greatest rival, a man he had fought against but also respected and had once called a friend, he reportedly wept. This is the first thing you need to understand about Caesar in Egypt. He arrived in a deeply complicated emotional state at the head of a relatively small force of only 3,200 soldiers in a foreign city of hundreds of thousands, in the middle of a dynastic civil war he had not anticipated and had no particular desire to be involved in. He took up residence in the royal palace. Ptolemy XIII came to meet him, a 13-year-old boy dressed in royal robes, guided by his 3 ambitious advisors. Caesar was polite, but clearly unimpressed. Cleopatra, camped in the desert with her small army, understood with perfect clarity that everything now depended on Caesar. If Caesar supported her brother, she was finished. If she could persuade Caesar to support her, she had a chance. But she was outside Alexandria, unable to reach the palace without being intercepted by her brother's forces, who controlled the city. And so she arranged to be smuggled in. The method she chose is described by the ancient historian Plutarch, writing 150 years after the event. He says she was wrapped in a linen sack, later romanticized by later storytellers, into a Persian carpet, and carried into the palace by a loyal servant named Apollodorus. She was then unrolled or unwrapped in Caesar's private chambers. Was it a carpet? Was it a linen bag? The exact details are debated. What is not debated is the essential fact. Cleopatra got herself smuggled past her enemies into the presence of the most powerful man in the world, arriving unannounced and uninvited in his private rooms in the middle of the night. Think about what this required. Not beauty, courage, audacity, a complete willingness to take an enormous personal risk. If the plan had gone wrong, if the servant had been intercepted, if Caesar had reacted badly to the intrusion, she could have been killed or handed over to her brother. She was 21 years old. Caesar was 52. What happened next, according to every ancient source, is that they talked. And Cleopatra, in that first conversation, captivated Julius Caesar, not with her appearance, but with her intelligence, her political acuity, and the sheer extraordinary force of her personality. By morning, Caesar had decided to support her claim to the throne. What followed was not a peaceful political settlement. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors were furious when they discovered that Caesar had thrown his support behind Cleopatra. They responded by mobilizing the Alexandrian population against the Romans, turning the city into a war zone. For several months in the winter of 48 to 47 BC, Caesar and his small force were effectively besieged in the royal palace and the harbor district, fighting a desperate urban war against a hostile city and the Egyptian army. It was during this siege that one of the most debated events in ancient history may have occurred, the burning of the Library of Alexandria. The story, as it is commonly told, is that Caesar set fire to the ships in the harbor to prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him, and that the fire spread to the docks, and from the docks to the warehouses, and from the warehouses to the library itself, destroying the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled. The truth, as usual, is more complicated. Ancient sources are contradictory and confusing on this point. Some describe a fire at the docks that destroyed ships and warehouses, and a collection of books, possibly a warehouse near the harbor storing books for export rather than the library itself. Others describe the library surviving for centuries after Caesar's visit, which would be impossible if it had been completely destroyed in 48 BC. The most likely truth is that the fire during Caesar's siege damaged or destroyed a significant portion of the library's collection, possibly tens of thousands of scrolls, but did not destroy the entire institution. The library continued to function in a diminished form for several more centuries. But even a partial destruction was a catastrophe of incalculable proportions. Think of what may have been lost. The original manuscripts of Aristotle, the complete works of playwrights whose names we know, but whose works are almost entirely gone, scientific treatises, historical accounts, medical knowledge, mathematical discoveries. We will never know exactly what was lost that night in the harbor of Alexandria, but it is possible, perhaps even likely, that the fire that Caesar's men set to destroy a fleet of ships also destroyed knowledge that could have advanced human civilization by centuries. It is one of the great tragedies of ancient history, and it happened, at least in part, as a consequence of the political crisis that Cleopatra was navigating. The siege eventually ended. A relieving force arrived from Rome's eastern allies. The Egyptian army was defeated at the Battle of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII fled the battlefield and drowned in the river, weighed down, some accounts say, by the weight of his golden armor, and Cleopatra was restored to her throne. In the months that followed, Caesar and Cleopatra embarked on a famous journey up the Nile. This voyage has been endlessly romanticized, imagined as a pleasure cruise, a romantic idyll on the ancient river, and it was, no doubt, extraordinary in many ways. Caesar, one of the most sophisticated and intelligent men of his age, traveling through one of the oldest and most magnificent civilizations on earth, accompanied by a woman who was both its ruler and its most brilliant product. But it was not simply a holiday. It was a political and diplomatic mission. Cleopatra was showing Caesar her kingdom. She was demonstrating its wealth, its ancient traditions, its immense agricultural productivity. She was making the case in the most vivid possible way that Egypt was a prize worth protecting, and that she was the ruler best positioned to protect it and to align it with Rome's interests. She was also, during this journey, pregnant with Caesar's child. Later in 47 BC, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but the Alexandrians, with their characteristic wit, called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. The existence of this child was enormously significant politically. It created a bond between Egypt and Rome at the most personal possible level. It gave Cleopatra's dynasty a connection to the most powerful family in the Roman world, and it gave Caesar, who had no legitimate male heir, a son, however politically complicated that fact might be. Caesar returned to Rome, leaving Cleopatra on her throne. He had one of the most extraordinary years in Roman political history ahead of him. He was fighting wars in Asia Minor, in Africa, in Spain. He was reforming the Roman calendar, introducing the Julian calendar that would remain the standard in Europe for 1600 years. He was rewriting Roman law, reorganizing the Roman state, accumulating powers and honors that made him, in everything but name, the ruler of the Roman world. And then, on the Ides of March, the 15th of March, in 44 BC, he was assassinated. 23 senators stabbed him in the theater of Pompey in Rome. Among the assassins was a man named Marcus Junius Brutus, whom Caesar had considered a friend. When the news reached Alexandria, Cleopatra was in Rome. She had traveled there at Caesar's invitation, bringing Caesarion and a large Egyptian retinue, and had been living in one of Caesar's villas outside the city. She was present, if not in the theater itself, in Rome when the man who had restored her throne and fathered her child was murdered by his own senators. She returned to Egypt immediately. She was 25 years old. She had survived exile, civil war, siege, and the murder of her most powerful protector. She was alone on her throne again, in a kingdom surrounded by the chaos of a Roman world that was tearing itself apart over who would succeed Caesar. And she had a 3-year-old son with Caesar's blood in his veins. She was going to need every bit of her intelligence and her political skill for what was coming next. For several years after Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra watched and waited. Rome descended into civil war again. On one side stood Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, a young man of only 19 when Caesar died, whose cold intelligence and political ruthlessness would eventually make him the first Roman emperor. On the other side stood Mark Antony, Caesar's most senior general, a brilliant military commander, personally charismatic, beloved by his soldiers, but less politically subtle than his opponent. Cleopatra needed to choose a side, and she needed to choose correctly. She chose Antony. Her reasons were entirely rational. Antony controlled the eastern Mediterranean, the part of the Roman world that bordered Egypt and mattered most to her kingdom. He was a proven military commander, and he had something Octavian did not, a track record of genuine respect for Eastern kingdoms and their traditions. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey to account for Egypt's ambiguous position during the recent civil war. Cleopatra's response to this summons is one of the most famous moments of her reign, and it tells us everything about how she operated. She could have arrived quietly, like a subject appearing before a superior. She could have sent ambassadors. She could have written letters of explanation and apology. Instead, she staged an entrance so spectacular that it became legend. She arrived on a magnificent barge with a gilded stern and purple sails. The oars were silver, beaten to move in time with the music of flutes and pipes. Cleopatra herself sat beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, or, in the Egyptian tradition, as Isis, the great mother goddess. Around her were boys dressed as Cupid, waving fans. Her handmaidens, dressed as sea nymphs, attended the ropes and sails. The smell of burning incense drifted from the barge to the shore. The music carried across the water. The people of Tarsus, hearing of the spectacle, crowded to the riverside, so many of them that Antony, waiting in the marketplace to receive her formally, found himself sitting essentially alone, abandoned by the crowds who had gone to watch the Egyptian queen arrive. This was not seduction. This was political theater of the highest order. Cleopatra was not appearing before Antony as a supplicant. She was presenting herself as his equal, as a goddess, as the ruler of the wealthiest kingdom in the world, as a force of nature. She was telling him, without a single word, that any alliance between them would be a partnership, not a submission. Antony, by all accounts, was completely captivated. He went aboard the barge. They dined together, and the alliance that would define the next decade of ancient history and very nearly change the course of Western civilization was born. In the years that followed, the relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony became both deeply personal and profoundly political. They cannot really be separated. They had 3 children together, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony spent extended periods in Alexandria, and ancient sources describe a life there of remarkable warmth and pleasure, elaborate dinner parties, competitions, and games, the kind of easy, intellectually rich companionship that comes from two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. But underneath the personal relationship was a political alliance of enormous ambition. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his military campaigns in the East. Cleopatra needed Antony's military power to protect Egypt and expand its territory. Together, they carved out an arrangement that gave each what they needed most. Antony made a series of grants of territory to Cleopatra that became known in Rome with horror and outrage as the donations of Alexandria. He formally gave her control of Cyprus, parts of what is now Lebanon and Syria, and other territories. He declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, to be the legitimate son and heir of Caesar. This last point was politically explosive. Octavian's entire claim to power rested on being Caesar's heir. If Caesarion was recognized as Caesar's legitimate son, Octavian's position was fundamentally undermined. The propaganda war between Rome and Alexandria intensified. Octavian's supporters portrayed Antony as a man who had abandoned Rome and Roman values, who had surrendered himself to an Eastern queen and her corrupting foreign influence. They depicted Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress, a scheming foreign woman who had bewitched Rome's greatest general and was using him to build her own empire at Rome's expense. This propaganda was devastatingly effective, and it is, largely, where our distorted image of Cleopatra comes from. The portrait of Cleopatra as a seductress, as a woman whose only real weapon was her sexuality. This is a Roman political attack created by her enemies to undermine her and to excuse Antony's alliance with her. It was not history, it was spin. The real Cleopatra was managing a vast kingdom, conducting complex diplomatic negotiations, commanding a navy, and making extraordinarily difficult strategic decisions under conditions of constant pressure. She was a head of state, not a seductress, but the propaganda worked. In 32 BC, Octavian declared war, not on Antony technically, but on Cleopatra. It was a clever move. By making Egypt the enemy rather than a Roman general, he framed the war as a defense of Rome against a foreign threat rather than a civil war between Romans. And it gave his campaign a moral clarity, the defense of Roman values against Eastern corruption that resonated deeply with the Roman people. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium on the 2nd of September in 31 BC. The battle took place in the waters off the western coast of Greece, near a headland called Actium. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a combined force of around 500 ships and nearly 100,000 soldiers. Octavian, supported by his brilliant admiral Agrippa, commanded a similar force. Cleopatra was present at the battle with her own squadron of 60 Egyptian warships. This was not unusual. She was a naval commander and co-belligerent, not a passenger. Her presence in the battle was entirely consistent with her role as Antony's equal partner. The battle itself did not go well for Antony and Cleopatra. Agrippa's tactics were superior. Antony's fleet was unable to break through the blockade. Ships began to defect or surrender. The battle was turning decisively against them. And then Cleopatra made a decision that has been debated and condemned ever since. She ordered her 60 ships to break through the line and sail south, back to Egypt. Antony, seeing her ships leaving, followed her. Later, Roman writers portrayed this as cowardice, as abandonment, as proof that Cleopatra's influence had corrupted Antony's military judgment. They wrote that she fled first and that the lovesick general followed her, sacrificing the battle for the sake of a woman. But there is another interpretation, and many modern historians find it more persuasive. Cleopatra had seen that the battle was lost. She made the rational decision to preserve her fleet, the most powerful naval force still under their control, and retreat to Egypt, where they could regroup and continue fighting. Antony followed because he agreed with her assessment and because, as her co-commander, it made strategic sense to stay together. The problem was that the retreat broke the morale of their remaining forces. Antony's legions on land, learning that their commander had left the battle, began to defect to Octavian. Within days, the military situation was beyond recovery. They sailed back to Alexandria together, and now, for the first time in her extraordinary life, Cleopatra faced a situation from which there was no political solution, no alliance to forge, no language to deploy, no strategic alliance to offer. Octavian was coming to Egypt with his army, and he was going to win. She began preparing. The final months of Cleopatra's life are both deeply moving and deeply revealing of her character. She did not collapse. She did not surrender to despair. She continued to govern Egypt, continued to conduct diplomacy, continued to think and plan and act like the ruler she had always been. She sent Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, now 16 years old, south toward India, out of Octavian's reach. She understood better than anyone what his existence meant to Octavian. He was a threat that could not be allowed to live. She also began to conduct secret negotiations with Octavian, trying to determine if there was any arrangement under which she and her remaining children could survive. She offered him wealth. She offered him cooperation. She tried to read, through the careful diplomatic language of his responses, whether there was any room for a deal. There was not. Octavian wanted Egypt's wealth. He wanted the political legitimacy of capturing Cleopatra, and he wanted to parade her through Rome in his triumph, the great victory procession through the streets of the capital, with the defeated enemy walking in chains before the conquering general. Antony's end came first. Falsely informed that Cleopatra was already dead, he fell on his sword, the Roman way to die with honor. He did not die immediately, and he was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself. She refused to open the door, fearing a trick, fearing that Octavian's soldiers would rush in behind Antony. Instead, she and her servants lowered ropes from a window and hauled the dying man up the side of the building. He died in her arms. Octavian took Alexandria without resistance on the 1st of August in 30 BC. He entered the city. He met Cleopatra once, in her own palace, in a controlled audience designed to make clear the new order of things. Cleopatra was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years. She had navigated the most complex and dangerous political situation in the ancient world with extraordinary skill and intelligence. She had very nearly succeeded in creating an alliance powerful enough to stand against Rome itself. And now it was over. She understood what Octavian intended. She had heard of Rome's triumphs. She knew what it meant to be paraded through the streets of the capital in chains, displayed to the jeering crowd as the defeated foreign queen. For a woman of Cleopatra's dignity and pride, for a pharaoh and a goddess, this was not merely humiliation. It was a kind of annihilation of everything she was. She chose differently. On the 12th of August in 30 BC, Cleopatra, dressed in her royal robes, wearing her crown, died in her chambers. How she died is not certain. The most famous story is the asp, a small Egyptian cobra, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. The asp was sacred in Egypt, an instrument of royal death, and its bite was associated with divine translation rather than mere mortality. To die by the cobra was, in the Egyptian tradition, to become a goddess. Other ancient sources suggest she may have used a pin or needle coated in poison. Octavian's doctors, called in immediately when her death was discovered, apparently found no clear cause of death, which would suggest a poison that left no obvious external mark, rather than the bite of a snake. We do not know for certain. What we know is that she chose her own ending. She denied Octavian his triumph. She refused to be displayed, defeated, and diminished before the Roman crowd. 2 of her handmaidens died with her. When Octavian's men broke into the chamber and found her body, one of them reportedly demanded of a still-living handmaiden, "Was this well done?" The handmaiden replied, "Extremely well done, and befitting the descendant of so many kings." Octavian, who would soon take the name Augustus and become Rome's first emperor, had Caesarion killed. He could not afford to let Caesar's son live. Egypt became a Roman province. Its vast wealth flowed to Rome, funding the golden age of the Augustan Empire. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for 275 years, was over, and the memory of Cleopatra began its long and strange transformation. Roman writers, all of them on the winning side, all of them writing under Octavian's regime, cemented the portrait of Cleopatra that would dominate for 2,000 years. She was the Eastern temptress, the dangerous queen who had led a great Roman general to destruction, the woman who had threatened Rome with her sexuality and her scheming. This portrait served Rome's political purposes perfectly. It justified the war. It explained Antony's behavior. It made Octavian's victory a moral triumph rather than simply a military one. But it was, in all its essential features, a lie. The real Cleopatra was something far more interesting and far more admirable. She was the last great ruler of the ancient world's most extraordinary dynasty. She was a scholar, a linguist, a mathematician, a naval commander, and a politician of extraordinary skill. She ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth through 21 years of almost constant crisis, using her intelligence and her courage to navigate impossible situations. She formed alliances with the two most powerful men of her age, not because she seduced them, but because she was the most compelling political partner available to them, a sovereign of genuine power and genuine intelligence who could offer something no Roman politician could provide: the wealth and stability of Egypt, and the brilliant mind of a queen who understood the ancient world better than almost anyone alive. She came closer than anyone since Alexander the Great to fundamentally changing the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. If Actium had gone differently, if the battle had turned in the other direction, it is not impossible to imagine a world in which Rome's Eastern Empire was built around an Egypto-Roman partnership rather than straightforward conquest. A world in which Caesarion sat on a throne in Alexandria, and the grandchildren of Cleopatra ruled alongside the emperors of Rome. It did not happen, but it very nearly did. What did happen was that Cleopatra died on her own terms, in her own chambers, in her royal robes, surrounded by women who loved her enough to die with her. And then, for 2,000 years, the world told stories about her beauty. It missed the point entirely. There is one final thing worth knowing about Cleopatra. We do not have a single surviving portrait that we can say with certainty is her. We have coins, small, worn, ancient coins, that show a profile of a woman with a prominent nose and a strong jaw, not the face of a classical beauty, the face of a real person, of a woman with character and intelligence in her features. We have ancient busts, carved in stone, that may or may not be her. Scholars debate which, if any, are genuine likenesses. And we have the written descriptions, most of them filtered through Roman hostility or the distorting lens of later romance. What we do not have is the Hollywood Cleopatra, the impossibly beautiful queen with the heavy eyeliner and the knowing smile. She is a creation of later centuries, built on the foundation of Roman propaganda and the needs of storytellers who found a complicated, brilliant politician less compelling than a legendary seductress. The real Cleopatra, the mathematician, the linguist, the naval commander, the 21-year-old who got herself smuggled past an army in a sack to argue her case before Julius Caesar, is more extraordinary than any legend. She is also a reminder of how history treats women who hold power, the same qualities that would be admired in a male ruler: ambition, intelligence, strategic alliance-making, the willingness to use every available tool to survive, were reframed in Cleopatra's case as seduction and manipulation. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony, which were genuine political partnerships between equals, were reduced to romances in which she was always the manipulator and they were always the victims. This distortion did not happen by accident. It was deliberate. It served specific political purposes, and it has been remarkably durable. But the evidence, carefully read, tells a different story. It tells the story of a woman who was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable rulers of the ancient world, a woman who fought for her kingdom with every tool available to her, including her extraordinary mind. A woman who, at the end, when there was nothing left to fight for, chose her own ending with the same decisive intelligence she had brought to every other moment of her extraordinary life. That is the real story behind Cleopatra, and it is, in every way that matters, more powerful than the legend. Thank you for joining me tonight on this long journey into the ancient world. I hope the story of this remarkable queen has brought the past to life in a new way. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.